The wait for Deltarune Chapter 5 off the back of Chapters 3 and 4 releasing at once was certainly a different change of pace to what we were used to. 3 years between Chapters 1 and 2, and then like 3.5 years between 2 and 3/4. It's sort of retroactively inconceivable to imagine that we only had to wait like a year and a half between now and the last pretty big blowout of content we got with the first release of 2 chapters at once. Mentions of chapters 6 and 7 development wise have gone from being hushed whispers to Toby pretty formally opening up that, like, yeah, you know, we're finally probably going to start working on chapter 7 by end of year. Just really puts into perspective, even considering the community consensus about the point chapter 5 seemingly leaves off on, that like we are so much closer to the end of Deltarune than I think we really realize. And yeah, you know, we're on the 5th entry of a 7 entry thing. Obviously we're going to be close to the end, but I don't know, like I find it helps temper some of the things that in my mind I was a little stubborn on with my immediate thoughts after I beat chapter 5. Like, there are obviously things I think are worth discussing about chapter 5's specific narrative and character development decisions. However, I find, you know, especially like, as you know, looking back at the bingo that my last video on Deltarune was about, I got completely lost in the idea that, you know, oh my god, Deltarune chapter 5, we've got only 2 more chapters left after that. We need all the lore dumps. We need to go to the shelter. We need to fucking meet Gaster. We need to follow the tale that shouldn't be followed. Like, it didn't really occur to me that, you know, even with what Toby was saying before chapter 5 released, which was let's enjoy the sunset before the storm rolls in, I didn't really register that I guess chapter 5 would be my favorite of the, I guess, adventure style chapters, which is so interesting off the back of chapter 3 intentionally subverting that structure in a lot of areas to build up to the suddenness of the night's interruption of the story up to that point. And then like chapter 4 was definitely, you know, I guess the, you know, another adventure dark world, so to say, but with the prophecy focus and especially Gerson's interactions pointing to Deltarune's meta philosophy, I want to say, it's just a nice change of pace that chapter 5 is the dark world that says, like, yeah, let's focus on a lovable cast of funny little characters in this fictional world, and let's just have some fun. All of the chapter 1 allusions across chapter 5, while they seemingly don't amount to much besides for maybe explaining why we overwrite Chris's save file in chapter 1, ergo Chris might have made the chapter 1 fountain, and that's why there's this sort of line between chapter 1, chapter 3, and chapter 5's imagery with certain facets of the Dark Worlds. There's definitely something really interesting that I didn't expect with chapter 5 before I went into it. That's like, this is the whimsy and the vibe of a chapter 1 type Dark World, but with the budget of chapter 4 onwards. There's something so distinctly confident and fully realized feeling in the ideas on display with Deltarune chapter 5. I mean, I certainly would have liked to see more of Asgore. I would have liked to see Asgore interacting with the flowers more. I would have just liked to learn a little bit more about December. Here's, I guess, my thing. Deltarune chapter 5 sets out to make you feel a lot of things, not just off the back of what Deltarune has attempted before, but in certain new ways. And I think it really, really, really achieves that in a way that makes me, I guess, not necessarily unwilling to acknowledge anything I deem as a flaw, but I'm certainly willing to excuse a lot of things off of valuing the work in front of me based off of the best foot it puts forward. I have a very, very solid idea of what I want to focus my praise on for this video, but before we can do that, I want to establish a baseline with my general thoughts on things across chapter 5. you know, before I go completely whole hog in just praising this one very, very specific part of the game that stood out to me.
It's Manjarona.
Chapter 5 of Deltarune looks good. Like the jump between chapters 1 and 2, and then 2 and 3/4, Chapter 5 continues to iterate on the style presented by Toby Fox in ways that scales well with the broader increase of the narrative and its scope. I definitely do understand a lot more the discussion that I did see sort of pop up before Chapter 5 released, which is, with these newer chapters visibly showing an increase in budget and fidelity, past chapters are left feeling a little odd in comparison with what they decided to focus on at the time. Stuff like Chris only getting a proper slide animation in Chapter 3 is really weird if you go back and play Chapter 1 in a fairly close time span to when you would see that in Chapter 3. And it's like the game is not made worse to a degree that my experience is actively reduced in positivity because of this, but it is just odd, you know, especially as somebody that did a full replay just before Chapter 5 released. Just as Chapter 4's pseudo 3D sections give that chapter a much greater feeling of innovation when compared to past ones, Chapter 5's newly introduced mechanic with the feather is so mind-blowing, frankly. I mean, I never would have expected that when Toby described the idea of Chapter 5's gimmick still needing to be implemented, that he essentially meant, I guess, we need to implement the whole other half of the chapter. Like, I was in awe at how much it committed to, like, really taking advantage of what this radical departure offers, not just for structuring the game at that moment, but giving more visual emphasis and oomph in areas that otherwise might not have been conveyable with just the regular approach. Like, even the mechanics we've gotten up to this point have been pretty firm in maintaining the fact that Deltarune is a top-down RPG. So for the game to just, I mean, like when you think about it logistically, like, an idea like Toby's, especially with how we don't know if it's going to be reused in future chapters, for him to just go like, hey, what if half of this chapter was an action platformer? I don't understand how they arrived at that point and the work needed to actually like get there and make that viable, but the fact they did is so incredibly impressive. I think even, you know, after Chapter 5 spent so much of its energy really trying to convey the scale of the Dark World and the sheer depth of the aesthetics on display, that is really the thing that enamored me the most visually with this chapter. The fact that Toby Fox essentially doubled or tripled the workload visually and, I guess, mechanically for the team working with him, and they managed to nail the landing as if it was effortless. It just feels like one of those ideas that's good in theory, but nobody touches because of the sheer execution barrier required, and the fact that Toby and his crew just did it, and all the pieces fit together so wonderfully, it almost makes me sort of say, like, what, it took you this long to get to this? And of course it did. Deltarune's been in development for almost 10 years now. This is the kind of work you only get from banging your head against a wall for 10 years. So ignoring the obnoxiously shaped elephant in the room that is the feather and all of the visual work required to go into that, that's worth acknowledging. Chapter 5 is also worth acknowledgement from a stylistic standpoint for the iterations it offers in exploring the expressiveness of things like the overworld sprites. I don't want to get too ahead of myself, but especially in the weird route, I mean, I would say 75% of the sheer impact from what the Weird Route offers thematically in Chapter 5 comes down to the very specific facial sprites and overworld sprites used for Noelle. I know as soon as the release, everybody mentioned that one scene where Susie and Ralsei look to each other and their chat portraits also look to each other. That's a very good set of overworld/chat box sprites that just brings up really how much more expressive they are in this chapter as a whole. I'm really partial to that one animation that Toby teased with the piece of concept art years ago, searching for mites and fleas, or the little, like, you know, bottom right corner of the chat box animation that appears for Susie when you open up the infinite chest of flowery dollars. Considering Undertale barely did anything really fancy with the text boxes, while Deltarune is iterating on them with the facial sprites and whatnot, I can definitely see why originally Toby was like, yeah, I'm gonna need a team of people to get this done if I even want it close to my original vision. And you know, God bless the fact that seemingly up to this point, that team has really started to hit its stride. Chapter 5 has a lot of enemy designs I really like within the context of Deltarune as a whole so far. It's nice to see that the artist Nelnal, who has contributed a few designs across the game's development, returned for a few NPC designs in Chapter 5. I say NPC designs instead of enemy designs. They designed 2 enemies and 2 NPCs that look like they would be enemies, but we never fight. Which, you know, bit of a tease, but who knows what Tricky Tony has up his sleeves. This is my personal favorite batch of enemy designs from any Dark World, and I think they feel the most cohesive overall. Granted, that is very much building off the back of the flowers as the focus of this chapter. Absolutely adore the flowers and all the little critters that exist to be around them. Just, you know, it's like more of a good thing to me. But if you're more interested in the little critters than you are the flowers, maybe you'll find the variety a little lacking. I really love that we got to finally fight the spinning ballerina enemy obstacles from the Chapter 1 overworld. The Floridans were nice. I actually would have liked them to appear more past that initial first section. I really like their bullet patterns, but that's not to say that I disliked all the other enemies that come next. It's just, you know, the Floridans are great in their own right, especially as a supporting cast of weirdos for the monsters as characterized by the Dark World, that it makes me a little sad that we don't really get to spend too much time with them combat-wise. Of course, we love the Kakas. They are just incredibly cute. The Leaflings are actually probably in my top 3 favorite enemies. I just love how whimsical they are. I mean, they're just some leaves that dance, and they're just so cute. I think probably the Netskis would be my favorite enemy of the whole chapter. I'm just a huge fan of the deceitful fox as an archetype in general, but also there's just a really nice flair to what they add to the chapter, sort of mythological feeling wise. Like, I get the sense that if we had more time to really exist in the Dark World, there might be some odd ends and stories here and there about the Netskis that tie into the individual background of all the Darkners in this Dark World specifically. The sheer amount of location variety in this chapter is completely unmatched when compared to past ones. I mean, you could make an argument that the cake still goes to something like Chapter 3, which has not only the location variety of its individual Dark World's vibes, but the mantle/board minigames on top of all that. It feels like everything I loved from the multiple biome approach to Chapter 1's environmental structure is just amped up to 11 with Chapter 5. You know, Chapter 1, bless its heart, but the color schemes and the actual aesthetic focuses of each individual area within its Dark World kind of all blend together and make it feel like a single seamless path that the characters are along, while at least with Chapter 5 to me, I really got this feeling like we were going through multiple different areas in this world. The chosen aesthetic variety between these major areas we passed through just feels so much more wide and various when compared to past Dark Worlds. Why is this Dark World Japanese? I bet Toby Fox played Mario Odyssey and saw that Bowser's Castle was Japanese in that. He was like, wow, that was pretty cool. I agree. I really liked Bowser's Castle for Mario Odyssey. So I kind of don't really mind it here at all. It's not really a valid comparison in the slightest. It is just interesting to me, though, that the aesthetic of this chapter is so explored but also so under elaborated on. I mean, of course, you have the suns in the background being the colored lamps above the flowers in Asgore's shop, and you know, you've got the literal field of pink and gold in the background of certain sections that you explore. I guess for me, I did find the chapter a little lacking on continuity explanations for why Asgore, who seemingly is only like surface level getting into anime at this point in his life, has his Dark World so visually overwhelmed by this very specific aesthetic. Not that I'm complaining, because there are a lot of things I absolutely adore about this Dark World in particular visually. I think the reasoning for why this Dark World is Japanese could really be as simple as Toby wanted to do a Dark World with a set of visuals like this, and you know what? He got a lot of mileage out of that idea. Isn't it crazy that they got the anime studio founded by Hideaki Anno to animate Flowery's introduction cutscene? I'm kind of running out of things to say off the top of my head right now. Anything else I want to bring up later, I just will. but man, I really just want to sit on that for a while. There is now a direct connection between Deltarune and the franchise Neon Genesis Evangelion. It just really helps, I guess, build towards Deltarune's overarching feeling like you can't really predict it. Like, Deltarune the game is almost a little amorphous in what it wants to be, and thus it can just blindside you out of nowhere with certain things. As I guess vaguely demonstrated with my past mentions of the feather mechanic in Chapter 5, I absolutely adore the gameplay iterations and even just the continuations of the gameplay we've come to expect from Deltarune with Chapter 5. I mean, of course, there's this part of me that really loves Deltarune for its RPG gameplay specifically that would have liked a little more of it in Chapter 5, but the action platforming stuff is way better on repeat playthroughs when compared to Chapter 3, which was half taken up with the board minigames that were NES Zelda styled. I mean, I liked them on my first playthrough, but, you know, in the years since I've replayed Chapter 3 a few times, and as much as I really do appreciate the boards from a thematic and narrative standpoint, gameplay-wise, they don't hold a candle to how fun it is to revisit the action platforming stuff. Which I guess makes sense, you know, by the time we were finishing Board 2 in Deltarune Chapter 3, I was thinking, oh my god, I really don't want to do a third one, which is interesting in the context that a third board was indeed planned but then cut. But with the action platforming stuff, even as I beat Chapter 5, I was like, I wish there was a full game like this. I don't mean to leave things off there like I have nothing more of value to say. It's just, at least considering the reason I'm making this video, which is to justify some of my thoughts after the fact, I don't know what else to say besides I just enjoyed this. I mean, especially the action platforming stuff. There was no timeline where I ever could have expected it, but it's arguably way better than anything I could have expected. I am really curious what this chapter is going to do for me in the context of replaying Deltarune once Chapters 6 and 7 have finally released. Like, especially compared to Chapter 3, which I liked for similar pacing reasons of being a bit of an intentional stopgap, this chapter is just way more immediately exciting and interesting to go through than Chapter 3. Chapter 3 just kind of ends up wasting my time more than I would like past a certain point, I think. You know, I really do love Tenna, I really do love the sword route, but going through it after the fact, I have more of a reason to want to revisit Chapter 5 on its own if I'm getting that itch for Deltarune versus wanting to revisit something like Chapter 3. I do also acknowledge, though, that I am in a bit of a honeymoon phase with Chapter 5 since, you know, it's the most recent Deltarune release. We all love new Deltarune releases, and it's a little easy to get whipped up in the excitement of just getting more to chew on. I have a feeling that Chapter 5 will actually appreciate and value like a fine wine, as more and more of the narrative questions we're currently left with unanswered do eventually get their answers. Though from a gameplay standpoint, how Chapter 5 might chalk up eventually to Chapters 6 and 7, I couldn't tell you. Anybody who's played Mother 3, do you remember the fact that Chapter 7 and Mother 3 was literally half the fucking game in length? If that's what Chapter 7 or even Chapter 6 ends up being, who knows what I will think about Chapter 5 in the grand scheme after that, you know? That's like asking somebody, hey, what do you think about Waterfall after you've played the True Lab in Undertale? I will mention just before we finish up this section, though, that I hope that Chapters 6 and 7 make more use of different enemies in the same battle. I felt Chapter 5 was a little lacking in that regard. You know, it felt like if I was going to be fighting a Floridin in a battle, it would always be 2 Floridin, or if I was going to be fighting a Shiri, it would be 2 Shiri, never a Shiri and a Leafling, or 2 Leaflings and a Floridin. And you know, this is the kind of thing that in theory having the dojo would be really good at fixing, but the dojos felt a little neglected in the last few chapters, even with Chapter 5 making a pretty big effort to give you more options. I mean, since Chapter 2, I've pretty much been waiting for Toby Fox to implement some way to fight the final bosses of the chapters or the secret bosses without needing to replay the full chapter again. What variety in specific enemy layouts I felt was lacking in Deltarune Chapter 5, though, is made up for with the fights against the flowers and how various they are in their mechanics. I mean, it's not made up for in the sense that it's an equivalent trade, but I think what we got with the flower fights more than offsets my personal feeling of wishing we had a little more time and variety with different enemy arrangements across Chapter 5. You'll come to find out that's sort of my perspective when it comes to the chapter at large, where what I feel it succeeds at more than offsets the things that I find are a little iffy. AKA anything the flowers touch turns to gold, and I'm totally here for it, because they made me feel a lot of very strong things. I overall did enjoy the design of a lot of the sparing mini games and the bullet pattern designs from enemies and bosses within this chapter. The attack that Seth does in their duo fight with Aqua, where they take the ability that you took damage to most against Aqua and throw that against you while combining something else. Not just one of the creative ideas for bullet pattern utilization in Chapter 5, but something that really ramps up the difficulty in a way that's dependent to your individual playthrough, and I absolutely love it. There are certain attacks that I personally did not struggle with that other people did, and that's so interesting to see. Although I am going to point at the spare mini game for the fight against blue and yellow. That one was a little better on my second playthrough, but on my first one, I was just frustrated that I was being forced to do something that wasn't what I was there for. I was there for a spare-based battle, and just the whole deduction, Ace Attorney sort of inspired minigame wasn't really up to my taste at that moment. It just felt like, I mean, like what I said earlier with Chapter 3, like it was wasting more of my time than I cared for. That's what I felt, and that's a little sad because I did really enjoy everything else with blue and yellow segment specifically. So for their fight to be my least favorite in the whole chapter, it's a little sad. Also, a bit of an extension of that is I wasn't huge on the fact that both Pink and Flowery's fights get interrupted before you physically bring their mercy bar to 100%. I had this complaint a little bit with the Titan fight in Chapter 4, and while that coasted by on hype moments in Aura, and also presumably being like, well, you know, like obviously we're not going to be expected to fight a full Titan at this point, but I would have liked more of an opportunity to get the health bar lower than we actually did before the cutscene kicked in. Chapter 5's equivalent of that was for the Mercy system with Flowery's fight. And, I mean, Pink is a little less, quote-unquote, egregious. I still very much enjoyed that fight. You know, it's getting to the point where I'm really, really interested to see how Deltarune, as an RPG, handles late-game RPG mechanics and number scalings, and I feel like cutscene-adjacent win condition fights are not really cutting it for showing me that. For what it's worth, I guess I don't really consider this a flaw with Chapter 5 itself as much as maybe something I've been anticipating with Deltarune going forward that wasn't super fulfilled with Chapter 4 and Chapter 5 to my taste, so I hope that future chapters do, so I don't look more unfavorably down on Chapter 5 just for doing something different.
Flowers blooms in your heart.
So this is the part of the video where I get to talk about the flowers, like really talk about them. But before we can do that, there are a few other characters that had pretty big roles / development they experienced in Chapter 5 that I think are worth acknowledging before we get to what I would argue is the best cast of characters that a Dark World has ever had in all of Deltarune so far. I'm not considering this beginning portion the Asgore section, quote-unquote, but I guess to cover my ass, you know, let's consider it that now. Asgore is an interesting character in the context of Chapter 5 because I really did expect this chapter to utilize him more than Chapter 3 would have with Toriel, and while it definitely did that by comparison, Asgore felt like the way he moved character dynamic wise was expected with the trajectory of the chapter, but like the things we actually focused on didn't really justify that enough to my tastes. I mean, nobody could have seen Toriel being used basically as a plot device to bounce Tenna's whole trying to appease humans and buying time until the night shows up thing. And while it would have almost made even more sense for Asgore to have taken that position with Chapter 5's narrative and just how sudden Chris made the Dark World for this chapter, I find myself both fascinated by, but also put off with, how active yet inactive Asgore was within the plot of Chapter 5 specifically. Like, the plot as in everything involving the flowers trying to show their love and adoration towards Asgore surrounds him and his presence in the world as, like, a theoretical tyrant level threat, but what he focuses on in that time and what ultimately sort of comes around as the Dark World naturally reaches its conclusion is that, I don't know, Asgore was always focused on and interested in the real world, and even as much as his conspiracies have deluded him to a sense, he's still, like, I think to the flowers and what they offer this chapter narratively as a facet of escapism to bounce off Asgore's desperation from, but he's so focused on his research, as in his own sort of escapist idea to go counter to what he experienced, that he's almost inoculated against the targeted escapism of Flowery and the other flowers. Frankly, I didn't really buy his whole thing surrounding Flowery of, now I understand what unwanted affection is like. I mean, Flowery was kind of not really anywhere close to how Asgore has been seemingly harassing Toriel in Hometown following their divorce. Like, especially, I guess, in the overarching context of how we see Flowery and Asgore interacting, with Asgore sort of going along with things, but like his heart isn't completely in going along with them for his own thoughts and wants. Um, it's just, it's a little odd, like, I mean, like, the ending of this chapter, especially the line about, knowing what it's like to receive unwanted affection now. This chapter concluded, especially Asgore's arc broadly, in the way that I would have expected before we got chapter 5. But it's not, we didn't arrive there in the way I thought we would, as in what the chapter ends up focusing on moment to moment across its whole runtime. Like, the way the chapter presents Asgore for most of its runtime as essentially existing in his own little bubble in the background of the story while we happen to run through the Dark World like normal. It's just odd, even keeping in mind the chapter 1 illusions and the way that you would think Asgore as a result would take a similar position to King. Like, especially with the way King in chapter 1 is meant to reference the outsider perspective of Asgore towards the end of Undertale, but for the new Darkner character, I mean, like, I can understand why Toby would have decided to structure things these ways. It's different from what I would have expected, and it doesn't totally sit right with me, but as I have time to think, I am certainly becoming more endeared towards certain decisions and narrative concessions he ended up making. I didn't really feel like Asgore progressed, as in he really, really grew of his own volition as a character, so much as he moved from the position he started in when the story began to this new position that seemingly might have relevance in its own right with the remaining amount of story yet to unfold. It almost makes me think a little bit to what I felt playing chapter 3 and 4, having expected, I mean, like, it was never a guarantee that chapters following chapter 2 were gonna, be as involved with Berdly and Noelle as quote-unquote guest characters, but, like, at this point, I mean, what is the point of what Berdly went through? I feel like it doesn't just end with what happened across chapter 2 from start to finish. I mean, like, especially with the way that Berdly both demonstrates his general positive traits more as is with when we see him in the chapters going forward, but also the way that his development has kind of stagnated a little bit because he believes that what happened in the Dark World was a dream. Honestly, maybe all my complaining literally just amounts to the fact that we don't have the full picture yet because Deltarune isn't finished yet. Who knows? Now, I won't say that Susie has quote-unquote regressed. I think her character development is a lot more nuanced than that. I do believe, however, her tendencies towards escapism are on full display with this chapter, which makes sense for her character off the back of chapter 4. We still don't know what was on that final prophecy panel. For all we know, Susie could have literally seen like universe anointed artwork of her being stabbed in the back by a mysterious stranger. Like, I think it does make sense that right now Susie is just trying her best to live with what's immediately in front of her, because she's spent so long, you know, expecting worse, that with things to suddenly improve, even though, you know, the end of the world is like a week away, you know, obviously she's just gonna take it and run with it. Susie Deltarune, if only you knew how much we loved you. It's kind of a shame that you have to bury your heart in the sand a little bit just to get through this chapter. It's weird, you know, I say that, but if anything, Susie's heart is the most on display it's ever been with any chapter, with just how much she's spent thinking about Noelle, which, thinking about the confession scene between Noelle and Susie at the end of the festival, I just can't in good faith say that the path Susie's character and emotional development takes within chapter 5 is a complete step back. I mean, just the sheer vulnerability on display of not only being able to think about a future that can be better for her, but a future with somebody who she isn't protecting herself from the worry they might not like her back. It's not what I would have expected off the back of chapter 3 and 4, and I think that'll make whatever comes next a lot more poignant. Susie was definitely emotionally challenged this chapter, but I feel like whatever comes next between, you know, the eventual reveal of Chris hiding things from them, or even, you know, with Ralsei hiding things from them, to the unfolding of the world itself happening in front of her, I just don't think going home to Castletown will be much of a viable escapist option for Susie going forward. And when that starts to happen, we are going to see her pushed to some very dark points. And while I thought we kind of would have been here by now, the fact we're not yet makes me wonder if it's gonna hit harder than I thought it would have when we do eventually get there. Susie Deltarune, though, fantastic job in putting down your emotional walls to accept the heart of another person into your life. The romance writing on display in this chapter was not just wonderful to see from a queer representation standpoint, or even for cementing Suzelle as something the narrative wants to explore textually, but because it's just emotionally moving and compellingly written stuff. One of my personal favorite things about the overarching plot of Deltarune is the short time scale it operates on. I think there's something so romantic feeling about the idea that so much could change in so little time. This has so far been effectively demonstrated by Deltarune with scenes like Susie being able to be vulnerable with Noelle in just a few days after getting to know Chris and opening up emotionally. Having that first-hand experience with Susie's abrasiveness in chapter 1 just makes it all the more exciting and emotionally involving to see her let her guard down slowly as these new chapters release. And this scene at the end of the festival, I feel, is definitely the sharpest demonstration of that so far. Part of why I hope Deltarune does have a happy ending to some degree is it would absolutely break my heart for all of Susie's vulnerability with Noelle here to essentially go nowhere because of circumstances she can't control. Or maybe that's an unfair way to look at it, at least in the context of chapter 5 specifically, because it hasn't gone nowhere. Susie has undoubtedly changed up to this point, and things have gotten better from where they were before the story started. You know, even if it doesn't last very long, does that mean it never happened? I definitely think that part of Susie's character arc going forward will involve her needing to accept the impermanence of certain things around her, especially in relation to things she can't control directly. As in, I guess her expectations for herself as applied by others are so high that if she doesn't match them, she almost has this feeling like she's not doing good enough of her own volition, as if that's something she can control or directly choose to do or not to do. This view of herself in its totality is being challenged across Deltarune's narrative so far, and I think final quote-unquote good or bad ending for Susie, there is something to be said about what she will learn getting there. Susie, even if you took some steps back this chapter, you took a whole lot of steps forward, and I am really proud of you. If only you could know how much you were loved. I would say Chapter 5 is pretty inarguably focused on Ralsei as a character. Parallel to Susie, Ralsei is another character who's seen a lot of narrative development and blossoming throughout the focus of the chapters we've gotten so far. Chapters 3 and 4 really started to focus on Ralsei's outer character traits, like lying by omission, and Chapter 5 maintains this momentum by giving us more of an introduction to the negative sides of Ralsei as a person when they allow themselves to be someone with flexible traits. Our quote-unquote prince, alone in deepest dark, has really been given a lot of room to grow within this chapter, resulting in, quite frankly, some of the funniest dialogue / scenario writing in the whole game so far. Pre-Chapter 5, there was a lot of fan content made for a brief period about the idea of like a Chapter 5 secret boss fight with Sans, where Sans would act as this countering force to Ralsei's, if Ralsei's whole thing is that they're petrified with their fear of what the prophecy brings, then you can take a character like Sans, connect them vaguely to the line of thought of the Shadow Crystal bosses, and go like, oh, this is like the healthier equivalent of these ideas that Ralsei needs to learn at some point, but hasn't because they haven't been alive for very long. The Chapter 1 allusions in Chapter 5 are actually quite interesting in this context, because you could view Ralsei's abrasiveness towards Flowery as an equivalency to the arc that Susie goes through in Chapter 1. Ralsei and Susie learn two fairly contextually different lessons from their individual arcs, but I would say both are rooted in the fundamental idea of rooting out something from within them that is repressed but on display to some degree within that chapter. With Susie, it's breaking down her tough girl persona as a set of walls that keep her heart from being hurt by others, and with Ralsei, it's challenging their own adjacent emotional walls but for trying to be the biggest people pleaser in the room out of a fear that anything else could lead to drastically worse results. Being, a flip on the fact that Susie starts out as a mean girl but becomes a lot nicer to be around, while Ralsei starts out trying to be super nice to be around, and in this chapter kind of becomes a massive fucking dick at certain points. Toby was really cooking when he came up with the idea of having Chapter 5's antagonist be that contrasting character who prods at Ralsei and pulls out these facets of their persona that they really don't want to show. Chris Dreamer is now another day into the worst week anyone has ever lived. Having to watch Chris third wheel on Noelle and Susie's festival date, now knowing for sure that at some point in the past, Chris had feelings for Noelle and even has some sort of feelings currently for Susie. I swear, watching this was giving me third-hand or fourth-hand embarrassment. Deltarune has been doing this really cool thing. With Chapter 1, at the start, Chris is presented to us as essentially a faceless, voiceless vessel for us to occupy, but slowly, starting with the end of Chapter 1, we get this reveal of pushback, and that gives way to us learning more and more slowly about the person we are occupying the game space with. This person is vastly more complex than we ever could have imagined when we viewed them as just another vessel for our input in the game world. This person is an angsty teenager, the only human in a town filled with monsters, someone constantly compared to and associated with an older brother who's now off at college, and someone deeply controlled by the guilt they've been carrying for years over their connection to an incident in the past that we've yet to learn the full scale of. This is Chris Dreamer, our protagonist character that we share space with in the game world of Deltarune, and Chris Dreamer is actively working against us. Chris is by no means evil or malevolent, as prone to chaos and mischief as they can be. I like how at the start of Chapter 5, even though it's very clear that Chris needs to make the Flower King Dark World in a panic, they still find the time to do their whole sort of brooding shtick. It just does a really good job of endearing me towards their character, of, they're in this conspiracy visibly, but I can't really be mad at them because one, it's visible that they're kind of just being dragged along for the ride. But two, it's also pretty clear that they're not really that good at their job of being a conspirator. I definitely understand a lot of why Chris acts the way they do. It's just really funny how dramatic they can be sometimes. It almost adds this unique extra layer of interaction to my dynamic with Chris as the player, where because they oppose me and on a narrative level it's kind of a little annoying at points, I want to be oppositional to them in turn by choosing stupid dialogue options and whatnot. I would have liked Chapter 5 to focus a little more broadly on Chris's relationship with the player character, but what we got was quite pleasant along the lines of what we've already gotten, and in some areas was actually quite unexpected. I'm particularly intrigued with why Chris would have picked up the seeds for the Golden Flower at the end of Chapter 5, like 5% intrigued and 95% scared, because knowing the thematic connections between Chris and Kara as characters, it's pretty obvious that Deltarune is referring in part to Kara's poisoning of themselves from Undertale, and Chris, I don't want you to poison yourself or like do anything else that would like hurt you. You don't need to repent for anything you've done in the past with pain. Like, Chris, I've been following you since 2018. You're making it to the end of Chapter 7 whether you want it or not. I've had a bit of a pit in my stomach as I record more video and get closer to this section that I've had mapped out for a while. Noelle gets a lot of interesting characterization in the main route of Chapter 5, with her date and subsequent confession sequence with Susie, though if you ask me, the more interesting to discuss and ponder development for Noelle's character, provided within Chapter 5, comes from the Weird Route. The focus of what's presented to us in the Weird Route has always kind of existed as a vague implication along the most extreme facet of Noelle's personality traits. It feels like Chapter 3 and 4's Weird Root differences off the back of Chapter 2 have been mostly focused on Chris's side of the equation and how we're hijacking their prior violent tendencies to enact a kind of cruelty they are otherwise actively avoiding. So what is Chapter 5 going to offer for the Weird Root? Well, it seems as if it's going back to the core of these ideas, starting with Noelle's introduction to Chapter 2 and the exploration of her feelings post-December's disappearance, manifesting as a desire for control and strength that she otherwise feels like she lacks in her real life. A lot of my general brain space towards what I love about Chapter 5 has manifested in thinking about the implications of what is presented with Noelle's character in the Weird Route. I think Noelle as a character and the arc she's gone through across Chapters 1 to 5 of Deltarune in the main route is made especially more filling as like a creative concept to engage with when I have the context of something like the Weird Route to show these absolute extremes of her character. My mind is made to go to Undertale and all of the little things we can learn about the other characters in the cast through, say, the varying neutral route endings, or even the extremes that they get pushed towards with the No Mercy route. In my mind, similar to how we see the bravery of a character like Alphys really start to shine in certain Undertale neutral endings, Noelle Holiday and her disassociation following the disappearance of her sister are best understood not just through the context of Deltarune's main route, but what the Weird Route has to present when these characters are put in positions they otherwise would not have ended up in. As this external hierarchical force being connected to this universe, while we are definitely bound by certain rules that give us the framework we operate within, the characters of this universe, though also bound by rules, aren't bound by the exact same set of rules we are. And within the ambiguity that occupies the space between us and this universe is a spot for us to impose our values on the narrative and characters in a way that can bend things over our knee given enough force. It is here that we get not just the most extreme and fascinating psychological developments on these characters yet, but a truly harrowing iteration on Toby Fox's ideas with the No Mercy route in Undertale. The same twisted love that would push somebody who plays Undertale to save the world, reset it, and save it again over and over. That same love that becomes so obsessed with the people and everything they have to share of this world that even killing them all is a valid way just to stay there for a little longer. That very twisted love becomes the basis for a way players prod the world of Deltarune so thoroughly they discover an unaccounted for sequence which, when iterated on, causes things to act in ways that would never have happened before. It's the kind of love for the universe and the characters that occupy it that when you hear that there's only one ending, there's nothing you can do to change that ending, and that things are going to end in tragedy to some degree, it makes you want to do anything, absolutely anything, to possibly get a better ending for these characters. And the really ironic thing about the place this love comes from is that it pushes you to deny the personhood of the characters of the game like it expects you to ascribe to them. Also, you can treat them more like the programming they actually are, and maybe, just maybe, achieve a different result. From this perspective of trying to understand the weird root through the lens of a kind of twisted endearment, I find myself personally understanding a little more why Chapter 5's weird root has so many things that seemingly connect back to Undertale's meta-narrative and the mystery of who W.D. Gaster is. The whole context of us being connected to the universe of Deltarune is arguably based upon the idea of Gaster doing some kind of experiment with this universe. I think the existence of the weird root within Deltarune is to, at least in part, reinforce this connection to Gaster and the reason we are even connected to the game to begin with. The idea that this is an experiment worth doing. I mean, sure, it's immoral, sure, it's unethical. What if you achieve the results you're looking for? What if the impossible is possible and you just need to try? You need to try everything, even the kinds of things that you tell yourself you shouldn't do. What if wiping away the consequences is as simple as deleting a save file? Can you really be faulted for pushing every option in that scenario? Something that made me really uncomfortable with myself after I finished the Chapter 5 Weird Root for the first time was the realization that I full-sended the proceeding in this scene, no questions asked. My thought process up to this point, especially being aware of the player's ability to bend reality, was, oh, I have to full send proceed over and over again because eventually Chris and Noel will be able to make it to the other side of the lake. And like, what I got was essentially the reward for doing that, but also a slap on the wrist from the game saying, wow, you really wanted that, didn't you? Because I found out after the fact, if I was any less persistent, I would have aborted the weird route and gone on to play Chapter 5 as normal. Just deeply emotionally challenging and personally harrowing stuff.
Sorry to keep you waiting.
Before Chapter 5's release, all we really knew is that the Dark World would involve Asgore in some way. The expectation is that he would have been the main antagonist and the main character focus of the arc. What we got was a little stranger, with Asgore more acting like a thematic anchor for the characters that chapter actually wanted to focus on to all revolve around. A pretty popular idea before Chapter 5 released was the idea that if a Dark World was made within Asgore's shop Flower King, that there could be a set of Darkners based off of 7 flowers on the second floor of his shop. The fanbase correctly assessed a connection between the colors of these flowers and the colors of the deceased human souls in Undertale. While there is definitely a lot we can intuit about Undertale now with this context of these soul traits in action within Deltarune, I'm not really going to be discussing the Undertale connections within this section, predominantly because it's just been a while since I've fully played Undertale. I mainly want to talk about Asgore's colored flowers within the context of what they achieve in Deltarune Chapter 5 specifically. Toby does something really interesting with the context of the Dark World this chapter, which is that despite being made by Chris, the space being so tethered to Asgore and the way he's treated it means that the narrative sort of kills two birds with one stone, with having the Flower Darkeners not just embody and convey deeper traits about Chris's character, but about Asgore's character too. And that's not even speaking about the individual traits that the Flower Darkeners display by being living beings elevated to a higher form of consciousness because of the darkness. We're going to cover the Flower Darkeners in the order they appear, safer Flowery. We're going to save him for last because he acts as a really good microcosm to tie together the thesis of all the other characters. I think I fell in love with the Flower Darkeners as quick as I did, in part because Aqua is the first non-flowery one we meet. Aqua's innocence and hyperactive energy is non-threatening enough to give the player a moment to let their guard down and start to become emotionally invested in these characters, who are otherwise narratively antagonistic towards our main cast. All of the Flower Darkeners, to varying degrees, express this kind of patheticness almost in a way that makes the tragedy of their opposition to you even more emotionally affecting. You can tell that these characters, both emotionally and literally, aren't built for this, as much as they can do some pretty heavy damage to you. One way or another, fate's hand is going to come down hard on them, and they're not going to be able to escape. Yet, they still stand their best against what is set to happen. As much as they all might be individually prone to certain flaws, they try their hardest to the bitter end. This admirability is really demonstrated towards the end of the chapter as we learn more and more about Flowery and why he/the other flowers are rallying so hard against the player. Each Flower Darkener has an innate contradiction to the trait that they embody, and what I find really interesting about Aqua is that her trait, despite being patience, is very clearly subverted by the fact that she is an inattentive, hyperactive young girl. Because Aqua is the first example of a character connected to Flowery's antagonistic group deciding they are willing to befriend and even assist the player characters, the main trio is granted this opportunity to present their best characteristics to the Flower Darkeners in a way that forces them to reconcile with the fact that these people who they are meant to stand against aren't as maybe objectively bad as one might hope if you were told, hey, you gotta stand in this person's way no matter what. With how overwhelming and firm Flowery is in the way he initially presents himself, to see the first Flower Darkener we get introduced to out of the bunch be someone who's a lot more loose and vulnerable to an extent really gives an interesting introduction point to learning more and more about these characters and why they are important to the core of what this chapter wants to explore. Aqua almost seems to treat the idea of being human as a bit of a running joke she's in on, in the sense that while all the other Flower Darkeners, to their own varying degrees, are more fascinated in trying to present themselves as a kind of human and thus seemingly worth Asgore's love in their eyes, she's not really so interested in the label and what that offers to her in her emotional certainty. If there's anything Aqua has over the other flowers, it's that she is certain and secure in who she is and what she likes. All the other flowers present these vague ideas of like uncertainty about who they want to be, or insecurity that who they present themselves as isn't acknowledged to the degree they want out of others. Blue and yellow don't really have like a neat singular definition for what's going on with them. I would present it broadly as this idea that who they want to be, they're confident in, but that is a very complicated thing in the different shapes it takes, which often breeds this cognitive dissonance visibly on display from how they struggle to handle these contradictions. And then you look at Aqua and it's like, this is Aqua. She likes playing games, she likes having fun, she likes getting up to a little bit of mischief every once in a while. If these conditions are met, she is satisfied. While there are definitely a lot of heartfelt moments across Chapter 5 with the other flowers, I do think it would be fair to assign Aqua as the whimsy/heart of the chapter, manifest in the form of a character. Besides for wanting to show her appreciation to Asgore now that she physically can, she's not really that tuned into Flowery's plot to stop the Lighteners. She goes along with orders presumably because it's fun, but very visibly when she starts to get bored, just decides to fuck off and do her own thing, which is an absolutely hysterical thing for a character to demonstrate when they are associated with the trait patience in universe. Aqua acts not just as a really distinct personality archetype among the Flower Darkeners, but as a really memorable 2 or 3 steps removed exploration of what Chris might have been like when they were younger. Like, you know, as much as the flowers present this idea of, oh, is this what a human is like? Because they are trying to understand how to present themselves to Asgore, there's also very much this component of what's implied to be a facet of Chris's angst about not being born as a monster imprinted onto these Darkeners when they were given a higher form of consciousness. And then there's also the reading that Aqua is connected to Chris because of, like, you know, Aqua uses knives and Chris uses a knife, and Aqua is the mischievous of the Flower Darkeners, and Chris was mischievous when they were younger. I think Aqua exists the way she does in Chapter 5, not just to give us an impression of what Chris might have been like when they were younger, but to give us the first signs within the language of the Dark World itself that Asgore is stuck in the past. as in, I guess this image in his head that he has of how Chris might have been when they were younger is so strong and connected to his current state of stagnation that it manifests to some degree within a Darkner that embodies some of those traits. Our introduction to Seth is also our introduction to the nuances and intricacies of how each Flower Darkner feels and thinks. Despite being introduced together with Aqua and presented as a dynamic duo by Deltarune's narrative, Seth's personality traits could not be presented as contrasting Aqua's any further. Where Aqua is a bit of a free spirit who just sort of goes with the flow and does whatever she wants when she wants, Seth is more anxious and affected by the expectations of others on top of their own very high expectations for themselves. One of the reasons that Seth is so important for characterizing the Flower Darkners at large is that they are the first Flower Darkner besides for Flowery to assign themselves a name. It's quite ironic then that despite being associated with the trait Perseverance and the Purple Heart from Undertale, that Seth is one of the Flower Darkners we see get discouraged most consistently across Chapter 5. I find that incredibly interesting in the context of each Flower Darkner having that sort of innate contradiction under the context of their traits. Seth is the Flower Darkner that we beat the most throughout Chapter 5, but they always get back up. They're even the first Dark World character that's managed to figure out what move the player character gets hit with the most, then deciding to use that against them more and more often in later encounters. Though Seth is always the first character to act like things are still going according to plan, even when things have gone horribly wrong, they're also visibly always the first character to try and take what went wrong and make something of it, truly living up to their association with the Perseverance trait, as often as their disposition might juxtapose it. With Seth, we are also introduced to the idea that the Flower Darkners have dreams of their own. Seth's dream involves a desire to read stories that they wrote to Asgore after Asgore spent so many years reading bedtime stories to the flowers while he cared for them. I would say Seth's quote-unquote dream goes a lot deeper than this though in regards to the exploration of the flowers and who they find themselves wanting to be when they are granted this higher state of consciousness. Each of the Flower Darkners doesn't exist specifically to try and give back to Asgore. They are fundamentally people discovering themselves for the first time ever. Seth's dream seems to root itself not just in a desire to be acknowledged as a human, but to have the potential and capabilities afforded to humans. It is here as a result where we start to get a better idea of what humanity even means to these budding personalities and how it differs to them based off of their own individual experiences and desires for the future. Seth models themselves very clearly in the image of Birdly, and I think this is meant to draw our attention to, I guess, the finality and weight of knowledge in the context of something impermanent. We learn pretty early on that the flowers are aware of what happens when the Dark Fountain is sealed, and that they're making the best of a bad situation by just trying to do what they can with the time they have. For a character like Seth, who's shown to get discouraged fairly easily, I think it's interesting that their connection to the trait Perseverance is in part characterized by a never-ending pursuit for knowledge. I get the sense that to someone like Seth, who's stuck in their head pretty often and is acutely aware of what will probably happen no matter what, the pursuit of knowledge and information ends up becoming a pursuit for certainty and the consistent, which, when you are a very delicate being who is elevated to a higher form of consciousness because of external circumstances you cannot control and maintain, I think it makes sense that the lack of control a character like Seth may feel would manifest in this reaching out for something that they can actually grab onto. It might even be why Seth is kind of bossy towards Aqua when we see the two work together. I definitely think at the least it puts into perspective why it's so important that Seth puts so much stock into their identity. For a character like Seth, who's kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place, unable to grab the reins of destiny in the way they might want to, I think there's really something of value to be said about Seth's journey of self-discovery and the way that helps them cope with the hand they've been dealt. Despite the very real obstacles that'll push Seth down, despite the things that'll probably happen no matter what they do, they always get back up and they always try their best, because that's the kind of person they are, and that's the kind of person they want to be. Upon reaching the flower castle, the player is met with two choices. Go left and encounter blue and yellow, or go right and encounter orange and green. I think the way these two duos are presented at relatively the same time as each other narratively is meant to speak to how similar they are to each other. There's something I kind of noticed about the flowers as they're paired off by the game itself. I guess bluntly, I've noticed the same duo archetype is repeated between Aqua and Seth, blue and yellow, and green and orange. I'm going to point to Aqua and Seth for starters. Aqua as a character I would define as assertive because she knows what she wants and she tends to know what she needs to do to get whatever she might want, to which she just kind of does it. As much as Seth will persevere given enough time and chances to try something, they are pretty easily discouraged and bound by insecurity and self-doubt. I would define Seth as the anxious/uncertain character type to Aqua's assertive character type. I think all the Flower Darkeners in Deltarune Chapter 5, including Flowery as a single source thematically, represents this dichotomy to some degree. I think if you really want to understand what makes the Flower Darkeners work, not just as individual components of a character dynamic, but as part of a duo dynamic in the way they are initially presented, you're gonna one way or another have to identify these two fundamental components of how these characters are written personality-wise, and interrogate the relationship they have to each other on an individual basis, character to character. So to say, I might call Aqua the assertive type, but Aqua, I would say, is like a 60 assertive to 40% uncertain kind of character ratio. As much as Aqua knows who she is in the current moment, there are still people she looks up to and actively seeks out the acknowledgement of. You could think of her youthful inexperience in this manner as a counterbalancing force to her assertiveness. Like, let's think about Seth using this line of thought. Seth as a character, especially in how often they participate in Chapter 5 as an antagonistic force, just would have fundamentally been really stale if all they did was oppose us and be the character who's like, grr, I'm the right-hand man. Like, you know, there's just something so much more interesting, especially to Seth's portrayal and embodiment of the trait perseverance, if there are a lot more elements on display to that, which might make us think or want to feel otherwise. Like if, despite presenting themselves as this mastermind who's always in control of the situation, they were actually someone who's kind of new to all this and still doesn't even really know what they're doing, but they're getting there. I want to use blue and yellow as the next example we focus on, in part because they're a little more straightforward to cover when compared to orange and green. Not to say that green is necessarily a complicated character to cover, it's more orange as a part of that dynamic that's more complicated to acknowledge because of their relationship to pink acting as a parallel to their dynamic with green. So to whip out the numbers first and foremost, I believe that yellow is 60% anxious and 40% assertive, and that blue is 60% assertive and 40% anxious. Blue and yellow complement each other in a way that makes their most extreme personality traits all that more defined when they are not beside each other. Without overt, direct social pressure immediately in front of blue, their integrity turns into a kind of stubbornness and selfishness towards their very specific way of thinking. Sure, they have integrity, it's just their wants and their needs are a little more important than others. Contrast this with yellow. The idea of being a justice is so rigid to them, they end up missing the forest for the trees, and especially in line with their personal gullibility, often acts with instinct towards trying to be a definition they don't even really properly understand themselves. Yellow's struggles with being internally consistent are often assisted by blue and their externally critical attitude. And it's only because of a character like Yellow, who is inexorably flawed in so many ways, that blue can get off their high horse. As much as I really do love Aqua and Seth, especially as our first introduction to the Flower Darkeners, I think blue and yellow are the duo that have the most chemistry out of the whole chapter. I think blue would be a lot more selfish and abrasive if they weren't actively challenged by the sensitivity that existing in an equal relationship with yellow demands. And I think yellow would be a lot quicker to go all in on any idea or feeling that comes to mind if he didn't have such a strong personality personality like Blue in his life, willing to push back against his often personally misguided viewpoint. I'm going to be honest when I say there's a pretty large part of me that wants to just talk about Yellow in this section. He is probably my favorite of the Flower Darkeners that isn't flowery. I think counting flowery is cheating a little bit. I do like Blue a lot in the way I like Green and Orange, which is that they are surrounding to the characters that really spoke to me and make the whole so much more memorable. But on their own, I kind of struggle to come up with things to say for them. It's like when I tell you why I like Yellow, I say that I really like his gag of being overly gullible and quick to self-loathe, or the way I find it emotionally memorable that Yellow implies both Chris and Asgore have a tendency towards trying to repent for perceived guilt by experiencing pain or hurting themselves. Yellow was interesting too for examining the newly born personalities of the Flower Darkeners. While he is still very on board with the idea of helping Asgore achieve his ideal world, quote unquote, he also just individually seems content to run around acting like his best idea of what a cowboy is because he wants to be a cowboy. It's endearing almost in the same way that a child might tell you, I want to be an astronaut or a firefighter when I grow up, except instead of flatly having my heart warmed by witnessing him live this fantasy out in front of us, I'm just kind of reminded that this is the best he can do with the very limited time he has until he becomes a flower again. I just know in my heart that for most people out there, when they finish chapter 5, one of their first thoughts was, man, I'm really sad I'm not going to get to see these Flower Darkeners in Castletown. Even from where I'm sitting, I can just imagine a ton of gags being written about Yellow's gullibility if he were to meet a character like Lancer, or God forbid, a character like Rule's Card. While Green is generally pushed towards a supportive comic relief role within Chapter 5 structuring, they have something really interesting to their name in regards to how they fare when compared to Blue and Aqua and their respective duo dynamics. As in, Aqua, Blue, and Green are open to acknowledge the good side of the protagonist group, leaving room for the openly antagonistic other half of their respective duos to let their guard down and start to befriend our player characters. While all the Flower Darkeners display a kind of protectiveness towards their next of kin, characters like Aqua, Green, and Blue demonstrate that there is support for the Lighteners even when the Flower Darkener who is giving the support acknowledges some kind of slight from the Lighteners towards someone they are protective of. Green fights us upon Orange's command, knowing to some degree that Rolsei has genuinely been bullying Orange, as sensitive as Orange might be in their own right, and yet in how they oppose the player characters, they go out of their way to provide healing even then. Blue is willing to give the Lighteners exactly what they want up until they learn that we have tricked Yellow. With characters who tend to be on the assertive side from the framework I provided before, they also tend to be the most open to working with the Lighteners. As in, even when their quote-unquote other half is actively chasing after the Lighteners, they stand as a counterbalancing force to force said character in opposition to have to at least acknowledge the positive qualities of the Lighteners. Orange is really interesting within the context of the number system I mentioned earlier, because while I would acknowledge them as a 60% anxious/uncertain to 40% assertive character type, the assertiveness, despite being the more limited facet of their character, is arguably what shines the most. As in, their most memorable component is not necessarily their anxiety, but the way that they are actively compensating for their anxiety in a way that shows in a larger-than-life personality. I like the way that Orange, despite being associated with the bravery soul trait from Undertale, is most predominantly defined, arguably, by their anxiety about how they are perceived, feeling to me at least super similar to Seth, and the way that despite being predominantly associated with the perseverance trait, Seth as a character Otherwise, mostly presents the idea of being anxious and easily discouraged. Seth always gets back up, and Orange always fights for the exact kind of person they want others to see them as. Even if deep down there's a part of them that knows they are acting out something more than it actually being true, the sheer confidence and hope in which they stand in the face of these ideas they wish were real makes them a kind of real in their own right. Green continues the narrative trend of the Flower Darkeners asking the audience to engage with their personalities through understanding the relationships they individually have with their associated soul trait from Undertale. Green, while being associated with the kindness trait from Undertale, otherwise seems to be a little impatient and short with people when it comes to their own personal needs/wants. Green's dream was to be a chef, whether you're a friend or foe. If you want them to make food for you, they'll make food for you. Even if you're threatening to destroy the world that's given them the chance to experience this dream, if they gotta fight you, they'll like attack in a way that uplifts others but also has the chance to heal you. It's just really funny to see patience and compassion granted by Green to such this degree when their running gag throughout a lot of chapter 5 is the fact they're kind of pushy about people owing them money. I do like Green, but I kind of need to speak a little bit now on like my feelings about the flowers as a whole. I definitely think they are much greater than the sum of their parts, but individually I think some flowers are a little more interesting to me than others. It's not that I don't like Green, but I did feel they were really underutilized to the fun of character exploration that I had come to expect with all the other Flower Darkeners. Like, especially in relation to Green and Orange's section in the Flower Castle. Green kind of feels like they get pushed around a lot by Orange, and I definitely see how that is solid establishing characterization for Green. You know, Green loves their fellow flowers, and obviously, you know, even if they're a little petty about certain things to their own degree, they seem like no matter how you treat them, they're going to choose to act kind to you because they want to. I just felt like, unfortunately, that led to a character who felt very passive and underexplored. I will acknowledge it's a good bit for everybody to just be like, yeah, Green's cool, but that doesn't say much about like really who Green individually is within the context of the Flower Darkeners and their position within their dark world. Like, on its own, it feels almost a little self-deflating from the scope of the narrative for things to just end there. Like, Green is cool, but they could be a little bit pushy if you owe them some money. I just would have liked a little bit more, but that's not necessarily a knock against what we have. And I would argue even it's a good thing to a certain degree that I'm left wanting more instead of left wishing we had less. That's also, too, past a certain point, just kind of what you have to acknowledge when you think about what fundamentally makes the idea of the Flower Darkeners emotionally compelling, which is their limited time in the narrative backing the scope of just how much potential and fun they could offer, especially with Pink. At the point that she enters the cast of the Flower Darkeners, you only get 2 cafe scenes and the game is kind of basically already over at that point. You just have to go and do Flowery's fight. It's just a little sad in my eyes. You know, I understand that that's the innate trade-off with how these characters are written, and in order to get that very poignant tonal note about the tragedy of how short their existence was, but how brave they were in fighting for it, you have to cut them short to some degree. That doesn't really apply with the Pink example I brought up. I should have specified that this is more my thoughts towards Green specifically. Especially the fact that Pink is seemingly set to be brought back to Castletown. I do expect more time with them, to the point at least that, you know, I would have liked more time with them and the Flower Darkeners specifically, and we're not going to get that again because seemingly we won't get anything of the Flower Darkeners again. You know, at least in regards to Pink, I'm willing to accept that there's a good chance we're probably going to have at least a little more time with them to offset the fact that we didn't have much time with them and the Flower Darkeners specifically. If you're interested in how I would rank the Flower Darkeners from favorite to least favorite, it's on screen right now. In my second and third playthroughs of Chapter 5, I really found myself appreciating Orange, Seth, and Blue more, though even within the context of my overall feelings now, having had about 2 months to sit on Chapter 5, I would still say that I was totally swept off my feet with Flowery, Aqua, and Yellow, and everyone else is kind of just outside that. Again, I don't hate any of these characters by any means whatsoever, but a few did speak to me a little more than the others. After I beat Chapter 5 for the first time and started looking into what people were saying in fandom spaces, I found myself really shocked by how divisive the reaction to Flowery was, even taking into account that the character is intentionally presented as a bit abrasive / annoying at first. It's personally hard for me to fathom that anybody would see that intro cutscene and not immediately fall in love with the character in front of them. I had a very guttural reaction to the introduction of Flowery. I just frankly wasn't expecting Toby to do another character introduction like this. Toby was very intentional with the way he introduced Tenna with the intention of shocking the player. And after that, I couldn't have really dreamed that he would ever have another idea, I guess, similarly worth presenting in such an upfront, out of nowhere feeling way. In Deltarune before Chapter 5, and even going back to Undertale, Toby Fox hasn't been shy about the fact that he's taking inspiration from JRPGs. And I want to say at least that nobody is really contesting the idea that Toby Fox has probably seen a few different anime and has even pulled inspiration from those. Going into Chapter 5 with the vague marketing, the most anime thing I expected was like allusions to Shintoist / Buddhist imagery. So for the first new character we meet upon entering the Dark World for this chapter to be some overly confident, obnoxious anime boy, well, I was just on board from the start. If you saw the bingo video I released a day before Chapter 5 dropped, you'll know that I went into Chapter 5 semi-expecting the escapist narrative to revolve around Asgore's relationship with another Darkner as someone who could fill the hole in his heart. I called it Asgore waifu theory as a joke because I thought it was demeaning to a funny degree to imagine Asgore with like an anime body pillow. What I neglected to consider was the homoerotic undertones of the unused Undertale clock dialogue we got, which suggests that Undertale Asgore and Undertale Rudy were more than close friends. It just seems so obvious in hindsight that a Darkner who stands to try and convince Asgore to stay in the Dark World would pull from his past with Rudy. Like, as much as Flowery's own individual thing is derived from that specific golden flower having a really odd idea of humanity, I do feel like you can't ignore the fact that I'm Asgore's old college roommate. Like, that is very clearly meant to point at Rudy. I definitely think that Deltarune Asgore has a similar yearning for his youth with Rudy to Undertale Asgore, and I think it's really funny that more than anything, that's what Flowery decides to amp up with his budding relationship with Asgore. It is, if anything, an indictment of how limited Flowery's perspective of being an actual person is. The way that he decides to approach interacting with Asgore as like showing him something that he remembers and immediately expecting him to jump on that instead of actually trying to form a relationship with him step by step in real time. It's really ironic that Flowery is the character making jabs at Ralsei and their desire to serve the Lightners, because by all accounts, Flowery is basically constantly kissing up to Asgore. Similar to Ralsei as well, there's some kind of fundamental basis of meta knowledge that Flowery has access to more than what is implied to be the baseline knowledge that Darkners / Lightners have to work with. Except counter to Ralsei and their anxiety about what would happen if they stray from the path they can see in front of them, Flowery stands with open and flagrant disregard towards the systems of the Dark Worlds because he is taking such a sharp, defiant stand against them with his very existence and dreams. This contrast between Flowery and Ralsei is especially interesting within the viewpoint of their relationships to the prophecy. Both Ralsei and Flowery are individuals that want to defy the prophecy. Ralsei has hope in their heart that a better outcome from the final tragedy could occur, and Flowery needs to have hope that something greater can happen if he and the people he loves just fights hard enough, because otherwise he is aware of how set in stone it is that this world, which was just opened, is going to be closed by a set of heroes going along a predetermined, much more important journey, in spite of what seems to be written in stone that this world, that this new kind of happiness was never meant to last. He just has to hope and fight the best he can for the kind of life he wishes was possible. Along this line of thought too is that Ralsei and Flowery are two personalities born from darkness to some degree that exist to reinforce the prophecy on top of their personal defiance of it, which is an especially ironic fate for a character like Flowery to some degree, because in the meta-narrative of Deltarune at large, their greatest impact might have just been existing as someone within one of the dark worlds needed for the prophecy to have run its course. It really speaks to me about the depth of Flowery's tragedy, the way that as a character, the event which granted him this higher state of consciousness that he now wants to fight for no matter what, also ended up dooming him, because per this dark world showing up in the prophecy pre-roaring / final tragedy, it suggests that it's just one of a few dark worlds that needs to be opened and closed before we can arrive at the event that incites the roaring and then allows the heroes to banish the angels' heaven. Flowery doesn't exist to defy the prophecy because that's just what he wants to do. He exists to defy the prophecy because that's the only reason he exists, and that's the only thing he can do. Off the back of Chapter 4 and its commentary on the deterministic ideas that Deltarune and its characters need to grapple with, I find Flowery's placement within Chapter 5 to be ultimately really needed for the emotional and thematic side of what Toby Fox is conveying, especially keeping in mind something Toby said in the newsletter released on August 5th, 2026. With Chapter 5, we apparently have all the pieces of the puzzle needed before we can start tackling the mysteries of Deltarune. Thinking along these lines, knowing that probably the most important emotional beats have yet to come, what can we say about Deltarune's emotional thesis now with all the characters we've met in the order we've met them? Examining Flowery with this lens helps me understand his position in Deltarune as not that dissimilar to the old man from Chapter 4. With the old man's arc, there's this very poignant tragedy about the fact that he represents a special kind of escapism that only dark worlds can offer, i.e. literally raising the dead and giving Susie a mentor she never would have had the opportunity to be with otherwise, before taking that away and saying that all dreams have to come to an end sooner or later. We see Flowery get positioned along Deltarune's philosophy of the white pen of hope, the idea that even if you know how things are going to end, you should try to trailblaze your own path anyways. Going into the final tragedy and whether or not it will be averted / changed, I think having a character like Flowery and their philosophy in the back of our minds is really important for coping with and internalizing Deltarune's final messaging and what it has to say overall about the conflict between fate and free will. For the last little bit of this section, I want to point at some of the lyrics of Flower Man and how I interpret them. I think you can determine a pretty solid viewpoint for how Flowery sees himself through Flower Man. 10 feet 20, the Flower Man is waiting for the touch of his hand, straightening petals out without a plan, like the everydaily wish that bothers the Flower Man. Could I do something to make him laugh? Inside my little chamber made of glass. I think 10 feet 20, the Flower Man is referring to the idea of presenting height as a value of feet and then inches. So to say, this line is Flowery saying that he is 10 feet 20, because Flowery doesn't really understand humanity and thusly he doesn't understand height measurements or conventions, so of course he would just choose 10 feet 20 because that sounds like, you know, bigger is better, I guess. Is waiting for the touch of his hand, I believe, refers to Flowery and the Flower Darkener's relationship with Asgore, in that everything they do throughout Chapter 5 to keep the Dark World alive is in part targeted at getting Asgore's acknowledgement. Straightening petals without a plan, like the everydaily wish that bothers the Flower Man, I believe is meant to evoke that both Flowery and Asgore are going through the motions aimlessly based off of both a wish and a worry that is constantly bothering them day to day. I will acknowledge though that I'm not really sure what straightening petals without a plan is meant to refer to. I mean, I understand the without a plan portion, especially because it's repeated down the line in the song, and is meant to evoke the idea that Flowery, having just been birthed into existence with this cause that he's committing himself to, otherwise doesn't really know how to go through the motions effectively. He's just doing what he's doing with what he's got. Could I do something to make him laugh? Inside my little chamber made of glass. I believe refers to Flowery's feelings of powerlessness outside the Dark World and his desire to make it back up to Asgore for all the years he cared for them after the one day that never happened. In essence, it's kind of conveying the idea of Asgore's dream of that one day being transferred in a sense to Flowery, and the persistence he has to maintain this dark world out of a desire to help make Asgore laugh from inside his little chamber made of glass. So he lived the flower man, with his heart in the sand. So he stands to watch the whole wide world from a can, way up high in the sky, with the sun in his eyes. Ain't it nice, the life forever for flowers. I think this section here is generally conveying the idea that Flowery is a very sheltered existence who, in spite of his upbringing, stands tall and looks forward to tomorrow with a sparkle in his eyes. Specifically, I want to point to "So he stands to watch the whole wide world from a can." It equates Flowery's engagement with / understanding of the broader world as being filtered through a small enclosed space like a can. With his heart in the sand, I believe refers to the idea that Flowery is actively ignoring / trying not to think about the time limit he's on. It's definitely gesturing towards the idea of burying one's head in the sand as a sign of their stubbornness, though replacing head in this instance with heart, I believe, is meant to evoke an idea that Flowery is emotionally repressing himself to some degree, or he's not allowing himself to feel certain feelings about his circumstances. So he stands to watch the whole wide world from a can is broadly referring to his aforementioned literal sheltered existence as a flower that is so sensitive it needs to be cared for daily within this small chamber of glass. Way up high in the sky, with the sun in his eyes, ain't it nice, the life forever for flowers, I believe is referring to the contradiction at Flowery's core. On his deathbed, he calls himself just a weak flower, and he laments the capabilities of flowers, yet he's become so much more than that, as evident by the fact he even can be way up high in the sky with the sun in his eyes. I took this last bit here, "Ain't it nice, the life forever for flowers," as Flowery making a self-aware jab at himself and the nature of his existence. Specifically, it read to me as sarcastic, like, "Ain't it nice, the life forever for flowers." Forever for flowers, referring to the idea that flowers kind of just sit around and don't do much on their own. But why Flowery would be making a sarcastic jab at that, I'm not really sure. Maybe there's something that he personally sees in the life of a flower as like a kind of ignorance is bliss, like it's very uncomplicated. 10 feet 20, the flower man is waiting for the touch of his hand, fallen to pieces, still without a plan, yet the everydayly hope that powered the flower man would never cower off of its path, even if broken. I am more than glass. Fallen to pieces, still without a plan, at first seems like just a reiteration of the prior line, straightening petals out without a plan. The context is distinctly insecure though when compared to that prior line. Straightening petals out without a plan is like, well, if you're straightening petals out, you must have some sort of idea about what you're doing. Fallen to pieces, still without a plan is like, okay, things have gotten really bad and you still don't know what you're doing. Yet the everydayly hope that powered the flower man would never cower off of its path, even if broken. I am more than glass. I think if we define the first half of this section as reiterating Flowery's aimlessness and the way he is defined by his upbringing, the second half of this section speaks about the way he stands in spite of it. The aforementioned wish that bothers the flower man is conflated with the hope that powers the flower man. As much as that wish is something that kind of emotionally and obligation-wise binds Flowery and the other flower darkeners, that same hope that can't be gotten rid of is so strong, it's described as never cowering off of its path. I do think the most important line out of the whole song, though, is this last part here, "Even if broken, I am more than glass." I really like the thematic connection this song makes between the imagery of glass and the idea of the precarious circumstances that gave the flower darkeners their consciousness. Also alluded to here is the way the flower darkeners are physically fragile in the light world. You can read this line from a few different standpoints. One reading is the way this refers to Flowery and how he can physically be killed, but the ideas of hope that he fights for can never be truly defeated, equating Flowery's existence to glass and the idea that glass may have more strength than the expected fragility of it. Or in other words, the idea that the flower darkeners, including Flowery, should not be defined by their limitations, but the way they stand in spite of them. Glass should not be defined by how easily it can shatter. What matters most is how strongly it will hold under certain circumstances.
I'm sorry once again I kept the lady in waiting.
Returning from the video I put out when chapters 3 and 4 released, this section is going to involve us listening to some excerpts from the songs I really liked in this chapter as a bit of a break from all the talking. Although, unlike how I handled things in my chapter 3 and 4 video, some of the songs we'll be covering in this section aren't officially included in the original soundtrack. If you're interested, I'll have some written thoughts on screen for each of the songs we cover. two really prominent thoughts that come to mind when I think about Chapter Five's music. Those being, wow, this chapter has the most guest/collaboration songs out of any previous chapter of Deltarune. And two, wow, the leitmotifs associated with Flowery and the flowers are so present across the general musical identity of the Flower King Dark World. I think Toby Fox, being the artist that we know him as, even still, really flexed his creative muscles with the musical storytelling of Chapter 5. It sort of feels like this is kind of what Toby's work has been building up to so far, at least. Like, obviously, he has greater plans, and this is only a very small slip at those plans, but like with how prevalent he is in reusing leitmotifs across his works in general, I feel like it's trained me to seek them out in a way that pieces together a story through just music alone. And I think that's really demonstrated well with how prevalent the leitmotif for the Seven Flowers/Flowery is across the musical identity of the Flower King Dark World. Chapter 5 having more guest tracks is a bit contentious in certain areas of discussion I've seen. Some people have even brought it up as like a sign that things might have gotten worse with Toby's wrist pain, affecting his ability to compose music for this chapter. I don't agree with that in any way whatsoever. I do truly just think that Toby has started to collab more and more with certain people more frequently, and that has in effect led to some fan-led Deltarune things being incorporated into the tone and feel of the final work. I don't think any examples of this are particularly egregious or unprecedented, especially with, for example, Garden of Hopes and Dreams being pretty much just a cover that Insane in the Rain made 7 years ago. That fits the tone of Chapter 5 to a T in a way that I did not initially suspect was part of a collaboration at first. Granted, I'm not familiar with the work of the original creator a ton, but even then, it's like, to me, it's a non-issue, even maybe worse than a non-issue, because I actively really enjoy the collaboration opportunities that some of this chapter displays. I think Flower Man is one of the most standout in tone and energy songs that Toby has ever included in any of his works, and it is so incredibly interesting to know after the release of Chapter 5 that Toby actively sought out Camelia's assistance in realizing this vision. I really, really love Toby Fox as a musician, and I think truly anything he himself decides he wants to do, he probably could if he put his mind and energy towards it, even taking into account his day-to-day personal difficulties. At the same time, however, that means I trust Toby's word when he says, I couldn't do this on my own, which I find a really befitting idea to be presented passively by the storytelling of the soundtrack, especially in the context of Chapter 5's character focus and the way the Seven Flower Darkners cannot conceivably fight for their dream without each other. Something that I won't hold to Chapter 5's original soundtrack like a grudge, but has definitely been on the mind more with this release, is some of the song placements in the original soundtrack / omissions are really, really odd. And then there was like the Forgotten Man's tracks, like there's the whole idea that he is existing sort of outside the story itself in a way even larger to, or at least on par with, a character like Gaster, so he's kind of, his stuff's not really going to be acknowledged in the soundtrack. And then there's the Weird Root stuff. The Weird Root bases its subtext and visual imagery a lot on creepypastas and the idea of video game unused content / bugs and glitch hunting. So of course the few exclusive songs to this route wouldn't be in the official soundtrack release. There's also the way that the soundtrack versions of certain songs with past chapters could be different from the way they're played in game. Toby likes to use Game Maker a lot to slow down or speed up or pitch down the songs just to alter their tone a little bit. And like, to me at least, I can understand why a lot of people probably wouldn't expect every single variation of a song to be included in the original soundtrack. I mentioned it during the music section, the little pop-up during the section with Cutie Mew Mew Magic. Why is that song in Pink's theme before Running Sky in the original soundtrack, despite the fact that you only encounter Pink after you've gone through the section that Running Sky first appears in. Mentioned in that little commentary bit, I do acknowledge the fact that going from Running Sky into Flower Man is really, really good, and having a pink break in between there, not the most ideal. I know I'm just going into semantics at this point. I really do love this chapter and its soundtrack, though following my first playthrough of it, subsequent playthroughs, and continued listening of what was added in this release, I'm just kind of unreasonably annoyed about songs like I'm Telling in Shop 3 playing in what feels like a completely different tone in-game, and then the soundtrack versions are like they're good, but it's not what I remember. It's literally not what I remember. These songs are played differently in-game, all while the unaltered version of these tracks just does not show up in the gameplay of Chapter 5. With Chapter 5 behind us, now begins the wait to Chapter 6. Something interesting I saw looking through past newsletters while working on this video is that in the September 14th Fall 2025 newsletter, Toby said that he didn't think Chapter 5 would be released in the first half of 2026. From our perspective, knowing that Deltarune Chapter 5 released June 24th, 2026, I feel like it's fair to say that if Toby were to provide another estimate further down the line about Chapter 6's development, it might be a bit of an overestimation for how long things might actually take. That's right, folks, you heard it here first. Toby says he thinks Chapter 6 is going to release in 2027. That means January 1st, 2027. Rev up those fryers, because Deltarune Chapter 6 will release exactly that day. I have faith that we won't be waiting more than a year and a half for the next installment of Deltarune. Maybe I would put money on that. Does anybody want to bet on that? I spent so long working on this video that the newsletter Toby said would release sometime after Chapter 5's release ended up dropping 2 weeks ago. This newsletter has a lot of juicy information along the lines of Toby's intention when writing the Flower Darkeners and what the development process for the platforming mechanic was like. I always enjoy in these lookbacks that Toby does after a chapter release, getting to see the years-old concept art from artists like Temmie. The concept art we've gotten for Chapter 5 is all exquisite, but I really love just how much of the art is actually comprised of Toby's drawings themselves. You know, there's something about the kind of intentional off-kilterness of how the Flower Darkeners are conveyed in their sprites that definitely rings very true to Toby and his design conventions. I really like this line that Toby puts in the section where he speaks about Nell's enemy contributions. Only 2 of them were used in Chapter 5 anyway. Maybe we'll be able to fight the Mantis/Archer enemies in Chapter 6's Castletown sequence. I want to say there's a slim chance that there will be some sort of Dark World revisiting gauntlet before Deltarune ends, but I wouldn't necessarily commit to that. On the day the newsletter released, one of the websites that Fangamer hosts associated with the Spanson sweepstakes updated with new interactivity. Deltarune.com/Chapter 5 now displays a new number when you scroll down the webpage. Said number is 2 or 3 times larger than the other ones on screen, which display to some degree the differences and the weird route between each chapter. Off the back of a successful lake skip in the Chapter 5 weird route, we knew that things would pick up again in a quote Chapter 7b. A 7b being displayed on this web page as larger than any of the other numbers, even when compared to Chapter 2, which has the largest number because that is the largest deviation from the main route, suggests that whatever will happen in this Chapter 7b, it'll be so different from the main route, you might as well consider it a completely separate chapter release entirely, leading into a new web page accessible by clicking on this 7b, indicating what seems to be the development of various facets of Chapter 7b and a declaration that it will release at the same time as Chapter 7. Safe to say, I am very, very excited because even at the end of Chapter 5's weird route, seeing that insert Chapter 7 side B text, I couldn't have imagined a world where we would essentially be getting 2 Chapter 7 releases in one, and that the weird route would deviate so much from the main story that we would just end up with a completely separate chapter along that storyline. I understand why and even personally support the idea of Chapter 6 releasing on its own, but there was this little part of me that wanted to see 2 more chapters release again. So of course, come the release of this most recent newsletter on top of the updated webpage, pages, and I found myself even more hyped than I already was just to get Chapter 7 on its own, because all of a sudden now we are getting 2 Chapter 7s. If we gotta wait something like 2 or even 3 years for Chapter 7 to be finished, I wouldn't really mind that. I mean, it would definitely be a different kind of wait to what we had to deal with between Chapters 1 and 2, but still, like, you know, if we had to wait multiple years for Chapter 7 to release, I would be okay with that on the assumption that Chapter 7 would just be super meaty in its own right. But now, again, knowing that we are getting 2 Chapter 7s, that would just make needing to wait all that more justified, in my opinion. All the same, it's just odd to think that we're finally here, so close to the end of Deltarune, even if we've got a good ways of waiting ahead of us. There's been a lot of discussion following the release of Chapter 5 about how much progress it makes towards exploring the meta-narrative and unraveling the mysteries at large. I really do understand a lot of the critiques, and in certain areas even agree with the comic consensus, though if I may get on my soapbox for a little bit, I feel like a lot of Deltarune superfans are burning themselves out really quickly on the new content and then getting mad at what's here that they can't keep going at their own pace. Not to act like Toby Fox / the intentional decisions he makes in structuring his work are quote-unquote blameless. I just feel like, unfortunately, there's a really pervasive lore / mystery hungry attitude that a lot of people in the fan base have, sort of actively drains the fun of experiencing the day-to-day weight of Deltarune before it is a completed work. I don't want this to sound like I'm saying, shut up and be grateful you're along for the ride. It's just, like, there's a very narrow focus that I've noticed in a lot of the discussion immediately following Chapter 5's release that puts its structuring decisions squarely on Toby, as if he just wasn't thinking straight in any way whatsoever, when I think the reality is closer to those decisions have their own positives and negatives and their own trade-offs, and in part because of the release schedule, those are further exasperated in a way that we can't really react to objectively in the context of what they will represent in the broader work when it is finished. At least for me, you know, even when I feel that there are certain things I wish were touched on more, I find it easier to just run with what we have and keep the anticipation rolling for that eventual getting more. And I know that some people are a little frustrated with what feels like the constant teasing, but I mean, as Toby said in this most recently released newsletter, after Chapter 7's release, you're gonna know why he structured things the way he did. I'm not at all saying that you can't have certain issues with decisions that Chapter 5 makes creatively, or that you can't vocalize them. I more just want to speak up on my perspective as somebody who is ride or die for Deltarune, but definitely starting to get a little tired in their own right. Like, I will agree, after the explosive introduction of the knight in Chapters 3 and 4, I would have at least liked them to have more of a presence in Chapter 5. It does also feel like Chapter 5, again, kicked the can down the road for explaining what happened on that day. The shift back to something closer to Chapter 1 following Chapter 4 in tone feels really odd, even though it seems like it's intentional from a standpoint of trying to convey regression. We don't really know truly where that's going to lead. We only know that a decision was made and this is the result of that, and it kind of just currently feels a little awkward standing on its own without any follow through we can really look towards. Deltarune Chapter 5 really spoke to me emotionally, to the point that I'm willing to overlook the things that kind of didn't sit right with me, on the basis that what did really impact me did its job so effectively. I can't help but think that's what matters when I should talk / think about this thing. I found that my real-time feelings of sadness about Deltarune's ending being closer in sight matched up really well with the plot of Chapter 5 being a kind of tribute towards the short-lived yet beautiful life of the Flower Darkners. I found that Chapter 5 did a really good job of reminding me of everything that had happened before this point, while also still reminding me that there's way more ahead of us. I found myself standing right beside Susie in wanting to just stick with the fun times while they last, knowing that it won't stay like that forever, wanting to squeeze just every last theoretical possible drop out of this moment before it goes away forever, feeling this not just in the context of where Deltarune's story currently is tonally, but where we are in this journey of following Deltarune release to release. Chapter 5 gave me a lot of reminders about what made me fall in love with Deltarune to begin with, all wrapped in completely new and unexpected things, paving the way wonderfully for a tomorrow I really hope doesn't come soon, but also couldn't come any sooner. I think there's a lot that I can personally learn from Flowery and the Flower Darkeners in the way they so unabashedly stand and fight for what they want. To them, it doesn't matter if it is or isn't written in stone that they're going to succeed, they're going to fight anyways because that's what they have to do. That really resonates with me in a deep existential way. I often find myself really struggling to get the motivation for things I want to do because I'm paralyzed by the fear that no matter what, my actions won't change the outcome. I mean, the fact you're even here right now able to hear my narration is because of the fact I'm powering through my insecurity about whether or not anybody actually wants to listen to me. Maybe I shouldn't care if anybody's gonna show up or not. Maybe I should just do because I want to. Maybe I should just do because I have to, because it's the only thing I can do. I think above all, no matter what, I'm just really glad that Deltarune is back once more, and that I'm able to immerse myself in this world with these characters and the writing of a creator I really, really admire.